moment today. It is the end of a very long campaign, and most of us don't know what we're going to do tomorrow. This is the finale of the library's fall lecture series. As you know, it matters, engage, participate, vote. And we've had a great series. I think many of you have come to every one. And by the way, just a reminder, the issues that we addressed were chosen by students, and most of us learned many things from the presentations that were given. I'd like to take a moment to thank the faculty who participated. Some of you are here. Thank you very much to the faculty for giving their time and expertise to address some of these huge issues that, oh, by the way, haven't gone away. So we know there's a follow-up lecture series there. Now today, we have the much anticipated post-election debriefing, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you our speakers today. And I'll start over here. This is Dr. Ruben Armiñana, who's the president of Sonoma State. And next to him, Pete Golis, who's a Press Democrat reporter and now a blogger. And they will be moderated, or we will all be moderated, by the ever enjoyable Dr. David McEwen from the Department of Political Science. Just before I turn it over, I want to let you know that the entire series has been captured, is up on the Sonoma State YouTube site, and apparently the easiest way to get there is to go to Google that force and just type in CSU Sonoma and it will come up. All right, over to you, David.
All right, thank you all for coming today. What we're going to do is I'm going to lay out a little bit of context just briefly about the election. Then we'll start with President Armiñana for a few opening remarks, and then to Pete Golis for his reactions, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. We should be at Q&A sometime between 12:15, 12:20, so we should be able to entertain as many of your questions as possible. Let me start by laying out the idea that this election is both historic and traditional. It's historic, obviously, for the aspect of race and how the potential for change that can result from that as a result of President-elect Obama's victory last night. And also the election is traditional. This has been an election that really has centered around the economy. And as a result, we've been able to predict with great accuracy what the vote totals were going to be last night, because the race has been over for about 3.5 weeks. So victory for the pollsters and for our models, because we were able to sit within about 5% confidence interval, 95% confidence interval with a 5% margin of error, to know what was going to happen for about 3 weeks. The second biggest story of last night, nationally, is what happened with Proposition 8. The delivery of Obama to the presidency meant that high levels of turnout by emerging voters, newly enfranchised, newly registered Latino voters, we've been waiting to show up, they showed up. Newly enfranchised and registered African American voters, they showed up. And emerging young voters, they showed up. They all also probably delivered a victory for Proposition 8. If Republicans see any silver lining, any red silver lining to yesterday's results, it is that they can take Proposition 8 in that campaign and roll it across the prairie and use it throughout the country. So that's the second biggest story. And if you don't buy that line, I would pay attention to what's happening with international media, because the story on the East Coast today, save what's happened in the White House, the story in Canada, the story in Europe, is not just Obama, it's Proposition 8 in California, which was about a $78 million campaign. So those are kind of the top two things that are going on. Now, before I turn it over to President Armiñana, let me lay out some questions to kind of prompt your Q&A. First, on the blue wave. How big and how deep the blue wave was last night remains open to question. There's this thing in political science called coattail theory. And I would argue that President-elect Obama's coattails were thin. We see some evidence that he brought some folks around, or brought some folks with him in terms of voting, but Mark Warner delivered Obama Virginia, not the other way around. So how thin or how deep the coattails are for Senator Obama, now President-elect Obama, is an important consideration. Next, the country remains purple. It's not a red-blue divide. it's really a purple country. If Obama has thin coattails and it's a purple country, have we really turned the corner on race? Has the Bradley effect become an effect that's really centered around homophobia and gays and lesbians and not race? Were there any surprises on election night? And what about the timing of the calls? The calls, as soon as the polls closed in the West, all the major networks made their calls 8:01, 8:03, 8:04. Where do we go from here? Because as much as the election is about the hope and about change and about the economy, we're really starting the 2010 electoral cycle today, the midterm election cycle, which really means we're starting the 2012 election cycle. And then we might think about the policy challenges that await the new members of Congress, the new senators, the new governors, and certainly the president-elect. So with that, let me turn it over to President Armagnan.
Thank you. First, let me publicly acknowledge that Dave, about 2 months ago, in this very same room, predicted a 5% victory for Obama. I think that's going to be right on the mark. He has told me that he also won a bet, $500, which he now has to declare because it's public. His tax might push him way beyond the $250,000 limit, and of course he'll be taxed soon. He'll become a Republican because his number in the Electoral College with the people who were betting with him was right on target, and it's a very large number, about almost a 2-to-1 margin for Mr. Obama. For McCune was right, and he's wealthier for it, but not as wealthy as he thought he was going to be. I'm going to talk a little bit about the national election and then a little bit about the local stuff about the states. First, you had a very, very appealing new personality, a new candidate, likable, engaging, young, not saddled in many ways with the past. There have been 3 candidates who have been related to the Vietnam War. They have not won. And a biracial candidate. A lot has been made about the first African American candidate. That is absolutely correct. He's an African American, not an American African. And that's it. And that's the future. You know, biracial characteristics are going to be a lot more common in the United States and as they are around the world. And I think he represented that. He did not run as Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton did, as somebody coming from the very American experience, what some pundits last night called the grievance candidate in terms of race. Obama has not done that. There'll be a lot of pressure for him on this issue, but he really was very new. He has a most appealing biography, different biography created, well, not created, but publicized by him. I mean, this is a candidate who really runs on 2 biographies written by him. And that gives him a great advantage about what we know of him. What we know of him is what he has told us about him. Not in the case of other candidates, by a long history. In a sense, he's a stealth candidate. We know very little about what he says and how what he says matches with his record. There is no real record to fight against. In the case of Mr. McCain, there is hundreds of votes in the Senate and in the House. In the case of President-elect Obama, very little. And that's very helpful. You are creating your own canvas and painting your own canvas rather than having a defined picture for you. If you add to that we have a nation which is exhausted with the present leadership, both in terms of foreign policy, primarily two wars, who, depends upon who you talk, have either moved forward very little or have moved backwards somewhat, and an economy who tanked about 3 weeks ago. And I have to tell you, I don't think there would have been a Republican candidate, no matter who or she might have been, who could have been able to take leadership in such a way to move the nation toward that candidate, given the economy. And that, I think, was very, very helpful. A near flawless campaigning. I tend to like candidates not necessarily for what they stand, but what kind of a campaign they run. And the Obama campaign was as flawless as you have seen, and it began with the caucuses. They understood the caucus, how they work, how you get support, how you can get a bunch of people excited and jumping versus going through the more established election system. And they were able to win the nomination by figuring that out versus Hillary Clinton, somebody with lots more of experience, and she told us that repeatedly, who followed the old playbook. They knew this was a new playbook, and they did it. And throughout the campaign, they had a strategy, and they delivered it, and they took the election to the red states. McCain had to spend all of his time defending territory that had been Bush-won territory. The battle never really moved to the blue states. The battle was always, until last night, and very effectively, in the red states. And that made McCain, I never saw it in McCain's strategy. I saw McCain tactics and jumping from one tactic to another, and against a very well-established strategy. And of course that didn't work out. In other comments, most of you are young. Not all of you are young. Despite all of the excitement and all of that about the young vote was almost statistically exactly in terms of numbers what happens in 2000 and 2004. There was not, in terms of percentage, a huge, any major increase in younger people's vote. The people who voted, the young people who voted, did vote overwhelmingly for Obama. Therefore, the strategy worked in getting that vote. But the thing about a very large increase in younger people's vote, it did not happen. And what also Obama was able to do is to truly, truly increase the African American vote, not nationwide, significantly, but in very key places. North Carolina, who had been for a number of years, this is the home of Jesse Helms, became a Democratic state. Florida became a Democratic state by coalition of large numbers of Afro-American and Hispanic voters. Again, very smartly done. In terms of Congress, and I agree with Dave that the coattails were not very large, But the Democrats who got elected in contested elections are not your liberal Democrats. They are the blue dog Democrats, much more conservative, much more fiscally to the right. Therefore, the solid Democratic Congress, even though the numbers are large, I think you're going to see some significant differences in the philosophical approach, especially to fiscal matters, within the elected Democratic members of Congress. I think that's enough of it.
All right, Pete?
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here. How's everybody? I got up at 5 o'clock this morning in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so I'll hang in there. I wanted, my wife likes to say that she and I arranged to give ourselves a front row seat to this presidential campaign. We, on the spur of the moment, we went to Iowa to see the caucuses up close. We were in Austin, Texas, which is a heck of a nice town. If you want to, I recommend Austin. And this week we were in New Mexico. This time yesterday I was in a precinct in what's the locals say is the toughest neighborhood in Albuquerque. Sometimes they call it the war zone. And talking to voters. And these are people who, in a material sense, don't have a lot. But what you were struck by over and over again was when you talk to these people, is they were voting for the first time, or they were voting after not voting for a long time. And there's a sense of possibilities here that Obama has set in motion that can have tremendous power. But of course, if you're my age and you grew up in the 60s and you were disappointed, you always worry that if that inspiration, if that hope doesn't pan out, then there's going to be more cynicism. It's an amazing moment. For someone like me, if you told me 7 or 8 years ago that in 2008 the United States of America was prepared to elect an African American as president by a landslide, I'd probably said you were wrong, crazy maybe. So it's just an extraordinary moment. But I think if you view Obama as an African American candidate, as someone who set out to be the first African American president, you miss the essence of what his campaign is about. This is a guy who's coming along and saying, the way this country is going isn't working, and I mean to make it right if I can. I think, for example, that Obama specifically chose not to be negative in this campaign in the way McCain and Palin were negative, because he really thinks about whether he will have a country to govern at the other end of that campaign. So I think those are some of the things he thinks about. I wrote down the words almost perfect campaign, which isn't far from what Ruben said. To me, no campaign in my memory has been so pitch perfect, almost from first to last, in terms of the message, in terms of what they wanted to accomplish, in terms of their patience. They never panicked. It seemed like some days it seemed like John McCain panicked twice a day. I mean, it's just an extraordinary thing. These are very smart people, Obama and the people closest to him. They just knew exactly what they were going to do, and they had the patience to believe in it and what they were doing and to keep going. I think it's also important to say about the Obama campaign is they embrace technology in a way that probably most people over 50 don't understand. The New York Times had a story today, and since I used to be employed by the New York Times and they occasionally give me a check, I should be careful here. But the story was how interesting this curiosity, how this new technology, how YouTube and the internet and all these things changed this election. It didn't change it, it transformed it. It will never be the same again. When Barack Obama chose his vice presidential candidate, how did he announce it? Did he call a press conference? He sent a text message. He sent a text message. They have used the internet to raise unbelievable amounts of money, to organize networks of people. YouTube and other online blogs and all the other opportunities people have for information have made it impossible for a handful of gatekeepers, made it impossible for the spinmeisters to direct the message. They've also made it so that the TV networks and the major newspapers aren't the only gatekeepers of information anymore. There's lots of stories that only existed because of the internet. The whole scandal in the Attorney General's office with the U.S. attorneys, that wasn't a story generated by newspapers, that was a story generated online. So I just think it's really important, and I promise you there will be books written, there will be all kinds of political operatives studying what Obama did in this campaign, because it's different from now on. Technology is transforming how we do our politics. I just finally wanted to say, I think now comes the hard part for Obama. I think he's thought all along that what he's been thinking all along about putting together a government and an effective government, which I don't think we could say of the last president, who seemed primarily focused on winning elections, and he never really thought about what it takes to govern the country. I think Obama's biggest problem, though, interestingly, is not going to be the Republican Party. I think it's going to be the Democratic Party. Because I think now that he has won this huge victory, I think a lot of the Democratic interest groups are going to expect payback. There are lots of things they're going to want to accomplish, and Obama may believe in the same things, but I think he's going to have to start to figure out where his priorities are. You know, can you do health care and you also do this? Can you do a green industry and also do what this other group wants to do? So I think it's a huge challenge for him. I think he's very smart and very patient. I think it's for political junkies, the last 10 months has been almost unbelievable. What a great gift. But in a lot of ways, for political scientists, the next 10 months may be more interesting, because this is a guy that's going to try to put together a new kind of government, and he's going to try to govern a country that in some ways is becoming ungovernable because we're so divided. So if he can pull this off, he'll be remembered. And that's all I have right now.
Dave, I
Sure.
want to add a couple of things. One, the playbook tells you that if you run against the incumbent, and he ran against Bush, McCain was almost an afterthought. It was a run against Bush, and it was always the Bush-McCain policy, Bush-McCain, but he really ran against Bush. And we knew, with an approval of less than 25%, boy, that's not a bad place to run against. And two, money remains the milk of politics. And the Obama campaign was masterful at gathering enormous amount of money. And pragmatic enough to know that when you have that advantage, you also don't follow your own promise to follow the federal limits, which McCain did. Now, he also didn't have that much money, but he held to that promise. And, the Obama got well over $200 million in donations, many of them using these new technologies. But money remains the milk of politics, and they knew that. For it's a combination of old and new, and whenever you need to change your mind on promises, you do that. And I think that might tell us something about the future.
All right, let's open it up to questions. Yes, sir, in the hat back here.
What do you guys expect out of Obama's inaugural address? What do you think he's going to discuss that?
Who would like to tackle the inaugural
The
themes?
address. Well, he's going to try very hard to make it perfect. I've never seen anyone who speak like him. I guess Reagan, in a different way, was an unbelievable public speaker, and John Kennedy. But he's an extraordinary public speaker. he just seemed, you put a microphone in front of him and his speech, I thought last night's speech was extraordinary and touched all the right notes. And I would think he and his people will be working hard to write a speech that will be remembered, because that becomes part of the ways one of the ways you lead, one of the ways you inspire people.
I agree with that. I think he's probably the best speaker we have had in many, many years. I think if you look at his acceptance speech for the nomination, and if you listen to last night's speech, you can probably tell what that inaugural speech is going to be about. The 2 or 3 of his major speeches have been basically the same speech with a bit of, change about the timing, but it's have been pretty consistent, about change, not necessarily defined, about uniting the country with no specific. I think you're going to hear sort of the 3rd chapter of that book in the inaugural speech. And I don't think you're going to hear at that time specific proposals.
I do think that's part of his skill, is that if you listen to a couple speeches consecutively, or 3 or 4, you think, was that the same speech? So, but part of his skill has been saying many of the same things, but putting a new spin on it so it sounds different. When you talk about the power of oratory, Obama basically became a national figure on the basis of about 25 minutes in 2004. If you've never seen the 2004 convention speech, some people were paying attention to him before that, but he basically came out of nowhere. Maybe he's lucky come along at a time where we have so few politicians that are good speakers, but he just knocked it out of the park and immediately became a national figure.
If you want to see it in person, we're offering a class for extended education. You can go to the inauguration. Let me, yes, sir, right here.
I just wanted to know, what do you feel was the effect of Sarah Palin being chosen as McCain's vice president?
Go for it.
I don't think it. I think it did. It didn't hurt. People think it hurt her. It hurt McCain. I think that the numbers show that it probably helped him by about 4 points, and it did consolidate a very weak base that he had. For I don't think it hurt him. I think what it didn't do as much as he wanted to do, especially with independents and especially with women. I don't think she was able to deliver a great deal of that, but I don't think it hurt. But I think you're going to be hearing more from Sarah Palin in the future.
I disagree with that. I think it did hurt. I think it hurt him in a couple of ways. I think it hurt him because if you look where the moderate voters went, they all went to Obama. If you look where the female voters went, they all went to Obama. I thought it was a very strange thing for McCain, who had this reputation as the moderate. When he finally got where he wanted to be and finally had the nomination, he ran to the right. That seemed a very strange thing. I think Sarah Palin also hurt McCain with some kinds of conservative Republicans who are all of a sudden wondering where the conservative movement is going. People like George Will and David Brooks, who wrote about this. My hunch is, and I could be wrong, I think Sarah Palin's going to have a short shelf life because I don't think her political skills they haven't been fully exposed yet. But maybe she will have a long and successful career. I guess she could end up with Ted Stevens' Senate seat. So who the heck knows?
Somebody will.
Somebody mentioned to me the other day that Bobby Jindal, who is the conservative governor of Louisiana, is appearing in Iowa in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
So there you go. And Jindal's not yet 40 years old, and by all accounts, he's a very smart guy. So
He's the Obama of the GOP.
That's
how they're
With
selling
a
it.
very different background. He's a Southeast Asian. I mean, from a very complex, difficult state, a state I know very well, Louisiana, and very appealing.
Yes, sir.
George Lakoff and other scholars have written a lot about the Republicans' ability to, over the years, kind of own the political language. Things like, there you go again, Mr. President, starting with Reagan, and then tax and spend, and talking about socialism. And in this campaign, it seemed that particularly Sarah Palin used those Karl Rovian kind of triggers. Do you think the language, you spoke of the eloquence of Obama, but do you think maybe that era, quote unquote, might be over, or the sloganeering seemed to win the day?
I think so. I think.
Sure. The question was whether or not the role of the sloganeering that characterized kind of the Rove et al. Approach to politics, whether or not we've turned the corner on that today, given the eloquence of Obama.
Well, this election is an imperfect test because the economy was such a huge issue that there were times when some of those wedge issues that Karl Rove and others used would work. But when the economy is tanking and people are scared to death, and you talk about Obama being a socialist, the average voter just says, well, you're trying to distract me. I got real problems. I can't talk about whatever social issue you want to put at me right now. I'm worried about putting food on the table. I do think that it's two things. One, I think Obama is generationally different than baby boomers. He doesn't get caught up in these old cultural war dialogues that we have for so long. And I think he's much better at seeing them for what they are and responding to them than older candidates are. In a strange way, Sarah Palin is old for her age because she basically is eager to get into that old baby boomer fight. And I think, as the baby boomers get older and a new generation comes along, they're going to look at that debate as kind of a curiosity. But I could be wrong.
President Armiani, you want to
No,
take
I
a
agree with that. I think it's sort of all politics, and like all slogans of that, they have their shelf life, and I think that those things have outdated their shelf life.
Robin, why don't you stand up and shout your question?
Do you have any projections for the cabinet names you think are going to come back?
The question was whether or not we have any projections for the cabinet or names that have been floated out and about. Either one of you?
There's only been a couple, three, and there hasn't been a lot out. And did you know better?
No, Manuel Ram,
For chief of staff.
for chief of staff, he himself announced that he had been approached. It hasn't come out from Obama's officials yet. Tough, Barry cut his teeth. Clinton, Chicago politics, which is in some ways very tough politics, similar to Louisiana politics.
I heard Leon Panetta this morning might be involved in the transition team.
I wouldn't be surprised. I think you're going to see a lot of Clinton faces. A lot of the names are associated with the Clinton administration in some ways.
The guy who runs the Fed in New York, Ted Geithner, is it?
Geithner.
Yeah.
He's
He's talking about him for Treasury Secretary.
All right. Let's
But
go.
I think you'll see a lot of people who we know from Clinton's days.
I think you'll see some Republicans too, by the way.
Okay. Provost and Cho?
There's quite a financial crisis going on right now, as we all know. The economy is headed for a recession, and many, many states are experiencing serious budget deficits, not just California. Is it possible, as the new Obama administration looks at ways of shoring up the economy, that there could be a bailout of states?
The question was whether or not, given the poor economy that state budgets especially are feeling constrained, is it possible there could be a bailout of states by the feds?
You're biased in this area.
Yeah, bias. The answer I have is, well, eventually, if you stand in line long enough, everybody's going to get bailed out in some form or another. Everybody's there. I'm not sure how. I mean, it's many places. It's not the idea; it's how you do it.
Education is part of infrastructure. How's that?
I would support that, but I'm not. But I don't. I think the federal issues are so large that I think state and local jurisdictions are just a little too far away from the reach of the federal government at this time.
Well,
I wouldn't count on it.
Yeah, there might be some sort of indirect bailout, but we got too many people in need of bailouts. I mean, at some point there's going to be there's hard reckoning to be made. I found it wonderfully ironic that a couple of weeks ago the governor of California said he was going to the federal government to borrow money from the federal government because the federal government has been such a model of financial stability. We're in for a tough time here, and I more, especially in California, I think we're in for a tough time because we really haven't caught up to how bad the state's finances are because they've been papering it over, and they pretty much run out of places to borrow money. Would you lend the state of California money? I'm not sure I would.
Perry?
The economy really determined this election, nothing else they done.
All right, so the question was if this election really was about the economy. So let me reframe your question a little bit. How quickly, when the economy doesn't turn around, how quickly does President Obama get saddled with poor economic performance? 6 months? A year?
I think
maybe not that long?
I think the honeymoon is going to be pretty short. Remember, Bush won, number one. It was the economy stupid. And, it sank him quickly for re-election, etc. And the reality of it is that presidents have very limited maneuverability about a quick change in the economy. Therefore, I think it's the kind of things that you win, and then you say the next day, "What the hell did I get into?" I think he wanted to get into it, but it's. I don't think it's going to be an easy term, an easy life. I think they're better organized than Clinton was. And I think that's going to make a big difference.
Pete, hold on just a second before you answer. Perry, let me give you some exit poll numbers related to the economy, which more than 9 in 10 voters, according to the exit polls, rated the economy as not so good or poor. Half said they were worried about the state of the economy for next year, and the dominant group of voters who said that the economy was bad or seriously off track voted for Obama by a 4-to-1 margin. Obama carried the married women with children group. That's a Bush group. Obama carried voters that make over $200,000 who aren't plumbers by 6 points. By 6 points. So I think that the notion of the economy driving the traditional approach to the election, combined with the historic nature of the Obama biography, is two competing themes for what this election means.
Well, we can debate this question forever. It's a great political science question because there's no answer to it. So we can go on forever. But there's another question. How much difference did it make? Where would Obama have been at the end of the day if he was a white candidate? That's an interesting question, too. How much did he lose because of the racism that's hard to measure in our culture. So both of those probably had some impact. The economy is obviously huge, but the economy did tank at the end of the day, and that's where we are, and we go forward from there.
All right, David? Yes.
Panelists mostly described this as an election about the economy, but what do you see as the possibility that this represents a realignment election from Republicans to Democrats? This morning in the New Republic's online webpage, John B. Judas writes an interesting piece where he says that demographic changes really amount to a tectonic shift that underlies this election. And his 3 points are that it's minorities shifting to the Democrats, women, especially single women, now that women are working much more, and that finally professionals in the new economy, the service economy, the high-tech economy, are shifting towards Democrats. And this is a wave of the future, at least the immediate future, and for the next couple decades could represent a realignment. I wonder if you buy that argument.
All right, so we don't know that there's a realignment that's happened until we've gone through 1 or 2 election cycles after that. So we don't know that 2008 has fundamentally changed until we hit 2012 or past that.
You go and deal with probabilities.
Well, I'm a big believer that generational change will have more to do with this than any sort of ideological realignment. Remember, in 2000, the Republicans were talking about this is an entire realignment to a more center-right country, and blah 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 blah. And then you have a new set of candidates, you have a new set of circumstances, and everything changes again. Obama got 52% of the vote, or something in that ballpark last night. So let's keep that in mind too. But I do think over time there's going to be a generational change that's going to look at race differently. They're going to look at a lot of things differently, and I think that's probably more likely to influence our politics than any kind of ideological realignment.
President Armiano?
I think you're going to see the Republicans are going to have to think about where do they stand. Have they lost their sort of Reagan bearings? They lost the suburbs, which traditionally are more affluent, more professional, people who I think are worried more about the economy, who have, a stake in the stock market. People in the inner city don't have a great deal of stake in the stock market, by definition. Under the present administration, the Republicans went big government, big deficit, big spending. And I think you're going to see a realignment about, are these the traditional Republican values that won them elections or not? And I think that's where you're going to see somebody like Bobby Jindal become a lot more articulate about these issues. And these are also much younger Republicans. McCain never really had a hold of the traditional sort of what I would,
the base.
Base. Never had. And it was not able, it came around a little bit at the end, and I think Sarah Palin helped in that, but it didn't. Obama makes enormous inroads among evangelical Christians. They're not particularly socially liberal. He makes inroads about people who own and support guns. I mean, if anything, the story is a realignment a bit of the Democrats, who have, in a sense, I'm not sure the congressional Democrats have, but clearly Obama moved to the center. And I think that shows in this attraction to areas which are more traditional values and Republican.
Laurel? The question was, what are other countries saying about Prop 8? I was contacted this morning by the BBC, Toronto Globe and Mail, another paper in London, and the French version of the Financial Times. They all wanted to know how, in such a big blue wave, California could go red. What's up with California voters? One of the questions was, "Are you all stoned?" And so, I mean, a lot of people are paying attention because they don't understand kind of the Jekyll and Hyde kind of voter. Maybe it is kind of this realignment change of folks that aren't particularly socially liberal who were drawn out to vote. That's at least the angle that's being played right now.
By traditional measurement, Proposition A should have failed big time. You have a large turnout, a large Democratic victory, an issue which should appeal to that population, and as of 11:48, which is the last time I checked, Proposition 8 was passing like by about 2%, very tight, might not remain, but it should not have happened, which means that there are, even in a state like California, there are some evangelical type values, and I'm not sure, and that's probably too broad of a answer, but those kind of things I think still hold pretty strong, and and both places ran a very strong campaign, and both were well financed. They match each other. By the way, and I know that everybody's concerned about Operation 8, but Proposition 11, the redistricting is barely passing. And there was not a great deal of opposition to it, and it shows you that, talk about a good government measure kind. I think it was passing at 11:48 by about 0.8%. Yeah. On some things that there was no opposition to it. It shows you, I think, that we have an electorate who's not very ideological stable, but it is issue oriented.
Yeah, they're ideologically thin.
Well, let me say about Proposition 11 that historically measures at the bottom of the ballot always do worse than measures at the top, for starters. Number two, having written about reapportionment for a lot of years, people don't give a damn about reapportionment. It's just something that bothers the politicians. They don't care. About Proposition 8, I don't think we should make too much of Proposition 8 in this way. I think the campaign against it came late. They had money, but it came late, number one. Number two, I think, at least in California, I can't speak for other places, I think the trends all show that, especially as the generational change occurs, that there's going to be less and less concern about gay marriage. That's going to recede as an issue, at least in places like California.
All right. Bill?
Yeah, I'd like to get back to the bully pulpit. And I'm fortunate enough to be old enough to hear the bully pulpit by Franklin Roosevelt. And maybe we have a little bit of it with Reagan, but I think that's the big difference we're going to see is, I think a democracy needs a bully pulpit as it's for the president to use, and certainly Obama can use that. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think that's his great potential, is his ability, if he can pull it off, to keep the country energized and use this sort of bipartisan, nonpartisan approach to issues to force more partisan politicians to fall in line because they're afraid of the public reaction. Now, can he pull that off? That's a big challenge. Because if it starts to come apart for him, it could get really divided very quickly.
President Armijo?
I think he's probably one of the most articulate and inspirational people. I think he probably soon will find out that probably doesn't have as much power as people think he does, but that his power is the power of inspiring and communicating. And he might become the next great communicator, and that's what he has done. He ran on that platform rather than on a great issues platform, and I think that's his strength, and I think he'll play to it.
You know, if Obama were here, we talk a lot about left and right and ideology in this industry. Obama is partly about an old-fashioned quality called competence. You know, competence is finally pretty good to Americans. And I think he's saying, look, I'm a stable guy, I'm smart, I'm going to get the best people in the room, and we're going to sit down and walk through these problems. And then I'm going to come back to you and say, this is what I think we ought to do. And, which is a very different approach. You know, it's not, look, things are tough, please go shopping. It's not that.
Catherine?
Yeah, I was changing my question. In the sponsored election thing last night, one of the themes that came up in the presentations was this idea that this country historically has had these sometimes competing, probably always competing, tendencies, one toward being more small d democratic, the other being more classically liberal, and the tension between the two, the majority versus protecting rights against the majority, specifically. And we were talking about whether or not Barack Obama was where he fit in that characterization, or if his way of doing things is the ushering in of a
Post-ideological?
No, because I don't think he's not ideological. I disagree with that, but he's not sort of, you know, as Pete, you're talking about, you know, George Bush blinders. I don't think he has blinders, but I think I think he's a very mainstream Democrat. I don't see him as being on the far left or far right. I don't see him as being completely a pragmatist. I see him as being a Democrat in that sense. And what's unique about him is this appeal that he has to people that is not about political party. And I'm trying to get something he's talking about here. To what extent is he really going to usher in a kind of change that makes us better than we are now? Is that he keeps saying this is what I can do, and knowing full well the constraints of the office that Ruben is talking about, knowing full well the constraints of the budget situation, the national and international situation, all of those things that face him. To what extent is he going to be able to do that, to bring about a kind of change? I mean, if he doesn't change the economy, are we going to be back to, oh, this guy's just another, you know, just empty promises, or are we still going to be saying, yeah, but look what he did. He changed the way we think about ourselves. He changed the way we think about our country. Does that make any sense at all?
So how about how well Obama's able to balance being practical and competent as opposed to being transformational, inspirational?
You can't be all three?
I wasn't asking about inspiration. I was asking about transformation. Thank you.
Well, it depends whether you mean transformational in terms of approach, method, or transformational in terms of turning this into Denmark. I don't think he's going to turn us into Denmark. But I think he's going to try to create a new paradigm, a new model in terms of how we work through our problems, because he sees we're not being able to work through them in our current model. You know, he's going to have people pull at him for right and the left. Even his friends on the left, you know, he's not going to be able to do everything. I mean, he said this last night because he's basically putting everybody on notice. Look, I'm going to try and navigate a way through this. Clearly, if you want to do more health care, if you want to do green industry, that makes you a Democrat with a big D. But not every Democrat's going to love everything he wants to do or what his priorities are. So I think that's the tough part. And of course, he's immediately going to be having the right hammer on him.
I don't know exactly how to articulate this, but
good. It makes two of us.
I think the great enigma about Obama is that he doesn't fit our classical American perspective of what people should be. He is, in many ways, one of the most internationalists by his own experience. Lived in other places, raised in Hawaii, probably the most mixed state in terms of cultures, races, still states that it's knows their boundaries because you walk 100 yards and you don't go anywhere but water. He is a sort of an immigrant in his own country, half immigrant, as his father is. His mother was sort of a, travel wanderer, but raised by very entrepreneurial grandparents. I don't think he's going to be that easily defined for a while, and that's the challenge, is to know who Obama really is, and probably only Obama knows that. I'm not sure he does. I mean, that's because of all of these confluences. At the same time, if you look at his record, he has been a pretty, in very limited way, because he was a half-term senator, and in his experience in Illinois, pretty limited too. But boy, in those experiences, he has followed a pretty standard liberal democratic ways. Would he be able to pull away from that structure and be more complex than that? I think that's the challenge, and I think he knows that. I don't think it's going to be that easy to categorize him early on enough. And one of the things he's going to have an issue with is running out of time. And I think he even yesterday, in his acceptance speech, says, we might not accomplish this in a year or even a term. Obviously, he's already running for a second term. But time is the great enemy of many of these of transformation. You run out of time.
I've been known to insult my own generation, so I'll do it one more time. I think when we say that Obama doesn't fit the model we're used to, we're talking about the model my generation is used to. I don't think Obama's such a big deal to people who are 35 or 30 or 25. And I think my generation, which we are the smartest generation, of course, but we pretty much see things in a way that I think the next generation doesn't see them, and we could probably learn from the next generation in that way. So I've insulted half the room at some point there.
Yes, sir.
I think part of that's because that generation is the largest table of material wealth ever known to man. Now that we're facing economic crisis, environmental crisis, we're going to see a man that's a centralist take office. And so I wanted to know about you guys' role, citizens in this generation and just citizens in general, our role in moving that to the left, moving to the right, and staying active over the next couple of years. Because essentially, he said in his speech that in the next term we might not be able to face this. We're facing something on the order of like a New Deal. Citizens' role in seeing the solutions at scale.
Let me reframe it a little bit. Ken, the results that we saw last night, can President-elect Obama sustain that social movement, especially amongst emerging voters, younger voters, newly engaged voters? Can those issues brought forth, those concerns, be sustained, that energy maintained? Well,
and what's the role of the citizen?
okay. So all these people voted for him last night. You can't just send them home. What do you give them to do?
Well, I think the challenge for citizens is going to be, in my generation's model, Obama is naive because we're all in this for our own selfish, narrow interests, and eventually the various interests will, as all through my generation have been doing, square off with each other, and they fight and claw and get nasty, and the country's divided. Obama talks a lot about this. When I talk about hope, people call me naive. But where the average citizen is going to be challenged is at some point the average citizen who supports Obama is not going to like something Obama does. And some special interest group that average citizen may belong to is going to say, well, that bastard Obama, it's time we find somebody new. We're not going to support him anymore. Well, sometimes average citizens are going to have to accept consensus that they don't entirely like. Because in a large, disparate society, if we're going to move anywhere, people occasionally have to deal with decisions they aren't entirely enthused about. And I think that's going to be the challenge.
Please.
Regarding Prop 8, what kind of legal challenges do you foresee if it passes? And what about all the people that have been getting married these last few months in places like California? What happens to their marriages, etc.?
Just before coming here, I read that the San Francisco city attorney plans to challenge the validity of the proposition system to change the Constitution. Good luck.
Good luck.
Therefore, I think that'll be, an interesting challenge. But I do think that the validity, I think this is not going to be something retroactive, and therefore if you got married at any time before it changes, I think it'll be from the day the Constitution gets changed, and I think that is not happening until January 1, and therefore, you are not going to lose your marriage if you got married before, but after January 1, the only people who would be able to get married in California will be a man and a woman if this proposition holds at this point. Until there's another proposition to change that. And I expect that to happen, not necessarily beginning in January, but somewhere along in the next 4 years, you're going to see that, because I do agree that the trend is if you want to be married, good luck, be married.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, in lieu of the political will to transform the monetary constraints of our system, do you believe that austerity will be enough to save our society from the ravages of war, as has been shown historically to be the consequence of failure to address inherent unstable monetary policy?
I'm not sure I understood your question, to be
Well,
fair.
in other words, if we lack the political will to transform our monetary policy with all of its constraints associated with that, how will austerity measures prevent us from relapsing into war that has historically been the consequence of not being able to reform this cycle of boom and bust with its winners and its losers, as you suggest?
I really think that I think monetary policy and going to war are very separate things. I mean, let me tell you, the kind of money we're spending in Iraq, and Afghanistan, but mostly Iraq, is not a good investment. I mean, let me tell you, and people who think that, hey, you should do it because Iraq has oil and we can control that oil, let me tell you, you can buy all the oil in the world for less monies that we're spending there. Therefore, I really don't think those two come together. I think you go to war because you feel certain national security is threatened, separate from the economic side.